Welcome to Americana Archives. Travel back in time with us as we go throughout America's historic newspapers to find the lost and forgotten history of America. Today's story is reported in the Albert Lee Freeborn County Standard of March 13th, 1907, coming from the great state of Minnesota. Today's story was originally reported in New York. The headline is Great Fortunes of Today, Not Computed Under 9 Figures. John D. Rockefeller's fortune, according to Frederick T. Gates, his almoner, cannot exceed $250 million to $300 million. This statement was made on Mr. Rockefeller's own estimate. While this figure indicates a smaller sum than Mr. Rockefeller has been popularly supposed possessed of, it leaves him still the richest man in America, although many believe Senator William Clark may prove eventually to be the richest man in the United States. Owing to his great undeveloped mining properties, his fortune cannot be accurately estimated. Furthermore, great fortunes, which may be placed in the same class as that of Mr. Rockefeller's, are by no means infrequent. The great fortune of today hovers around the $100 million mark. Half a dozen men and estates are rated at sums ranging anywhere from that figure to Mr. Rockefeller's $300 million. Such fortunes are sufficiently numerous to fix the standard in sums of 9 figures. Mr. Carnegie's vast accumulation. When the Carnegie Company was formed in New Jersey in March 1900, as a preliminary to the formation of the United States Steel Corporation, Mr. Carnegie was credited with $86,382,000 in stock and $88,147,000 in bonds, or $174,529,000 in all. He retired from business in the following year. At that time, his fortune was estimated at sums ranging from $166 million to $250 million, and his income at from $24 million to $26 million a year. His income is now about $15 million a year, according to a recent estimate. Conceding that his income for 6 years has averaged $20 million, or $120 million in all, he could have given at least $100 million without impairing his capital. Astor millions are inherited. The Astors, Vanderbilts, Golitz, and Goulds represent a class in which inherited wealth has been preserved and largely increased by succeeding generations. By this method, and in some instances by the creation of trust funds, a substitute has been found for the law of primogeniture and entail in England, a system which is forbidden in America. John Jacob Astor I died in 1848, the richest man of his day. His estate was worth $40 million. The bulk of it was left to his son William B. Astor, who devoted himself sedulously to the family real estate business. On his death in 1875, he left $130 million to his sons, $70 million given to John Jacob II, and $60 million to William. Both devoted their attention, like their father, to the family real estate. When William died in 1892, he is said to have left about $70 million, although the fortunes of his wife, Mrs. Astor, and his son, the present John Jacob Astor, are now considered larger. Although William Waldorf Astor is an Englishman by adoption, his wealth represents an American fortune. His father is said to have bequeathed to him a fortune of between $100 million and $150 million. The present value of the William Waldorf Astor estate is fixed at the latter figures. How Vanderbilt wealth grew. Commodore Vanderbilt believed in the concentration of the family wealth in competent hands. He left $90 million, the bulk of his estate, to his son, William H. Vanderbilt, and one half of the remaining $15 million to the latter's sons. When William H. Vanderbilt died in 1885, he had increased his inheritance to $200 million. His sons, William K. and Cornelius Vanderbilt II, received $50 million each. Each of his 8 children received $10 million, one half in trust, and $20 million was distributed in private bequests. Thus, the 2 sons acquired an inheritance, the present value of which is difficult to estimate. Mrs. Sage's Fund for Charity. Aside from Mr. Rockefeller and Mr. Carnegie, Mrs. Sage is the wealthy giver most in the public eye. Many have heard of the gentle-faced, childless woman in her 77th year, who cares nothing for society and whom dignity and humor are dominated by a kindly spirit and grave responsibilities which she keenly regrets. When Mr. Sage's will was filed on July 27th last, Mrs. Sage became the heir to the bulk of his property. 26 relatives were the beneficiaries of legacies of $25,000 each, which have largely been increased since then. After paying small private bequests, it was announced that the rest would be given away by Mrs. Sage. Before the will was filed, one estimate of the size of the fortune was $60 million. This was declared to be much too low. The estimate of Wall Street was $100 million. Other estimates since the will was filed have varied from $63 million to $93 million. The balance which Mrs. Sage will distribute is said to be more than $75 million. America's Richest Widow. The story of Mrs. Ann Waitman Walker's $120 million is not without its elements of tragedy. Most of her fortune came from her father, William Waitman of Philadelphia. Starting as a penniless boy in a laboratory, Mr. Waitman laid the foundation of his wealth in the quinine trade during the Civil War, and by introducing sugar-coated quinine pills. It was swelled rapidly by real estate investments in the heart of Philadelphia, including a theater, hotels, office buildings, and business and residential blocks. His friends were amazed when he died, leaving his entire fortune, except for a few small bequests, to Mrs. Walker, his daughter. There were absolutely no restrictions on her use of the money. The will contained no charitable bequests. His other descendants were practically ignored in the will. They were the 2 sons and 5 daughters of his dead sons, John Farr Waitman and William Waitman Jr., and 3 grandchildren. Mrs. Jones Wister, the widow of William Waitman Jr., since remarried, started to contest the will on behalf of her children, a suit which created a sensation in Philadelphia society and dragged for months through the courts. Hetty Green's Millions Grow. A third woman must be added to this list, Mrs. Hetty Howland Robinson Green, the woman financier. Mrs. Green has passed her 80 years and 10, and spent more than 40 years in active business life. She is probably the second richest woman in the country, her wealth being estimated at $100 million. She inherited $6 million in 1865 from her father, a whaler of New Bedford, Massachusetts. An aunt subsequently added $6 million more. She nearly doubled it before she married Edward H. Green. Her most important property is the Chemical National Bank, and her heirs are her two children, Edward Howland Robinson Green, who lives in Texas, and Miss Sylvia Green. Mrs. Green's frugal life, her skill as a financier, her ability as a money lender, and many eccentricities have resulted in innumerable anecdotes that have made her personality familiar. Millions from railroad deals. James J. Hill, president of the Great Northern Railroad and one of the masters of American railroads, is reputed to be worth $100 million. He is 68 years old and owns transportation facilities covering almost the entire continent and steamship lines to the Orient. His rise has been swift and comparatively recent. He saw his first opportunity in 1879 when he gained control of the St. Paul and Pacific Railroad, reorganized it, and started to develop the Northwest. In 1893, he completed the Great Northern to the Pacific Coast, with its 6,000 miles of lines and 1,000 miles of yards and sidings. He owns a superb fleet of steamships on the Great Lakes, including the boats of the Northern Steamship Company. Several of the great fortunes of the country must remain largely a matter of speculation. To this class belong the accumulations of J. Pierpont Morgan, H. H. Rogers, and E. H. Harriman. Mr. Morgan's fortune was recently estimated at $50 million, but this at best is a hazardous guess. Equally hazardous would be an estimate of Chicago Transact business amounting to more than $50 million a year. The real estate includes not less than 20 building sites in the heart of Chicago, block after block of land near the University of Chicago, hundreds of acres in the Calumet region, further south, and iron lands in Michigan. Of the stocks are large holdings in the Baltimore and Ohio, Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul, and Chicago and Northwestern. Jay Gould followed the example of the Vanderbilts and Astors in seeking to concentrate and conserve his vast fortune. It consisted chiefly of stocks and bonds of the various corporations in which he was interested when he died 15 years ago. They had at that time a market value of $81 million. His real estate was valued at $2 million. The net value of the estate was the wealth of Edward H. Harriman, the giant of Wall Street and master of 29,000 miles of railroads extending from ocean to ocean, and valued at more than $2 billion. A man of nearly 60 years, taciturn, secretive, even among his associates, unostentatious, and many benefactions. Mr. Harriman's wealth has been estimated at $150 million. Probably no one but himself knows how nearly his fortune approximates this sum. Great Gould and Field Estates. The estate of Marshall Field, the great merchant, has been valued at more than $100 million, and this is considered a conservative estimate. The stores belonging to the estate in Chicago are valued at $77 million. This money was placed in trust under certain conditions for his children. Senator Clark's new palace. Another multimillionaire from the West is Klaus Spreckels, the sugar refiner of San Francisco. For many years known as the Sugar King of the Hawaiian Islands. He is generally credited with being worth about $50 million. He joined the so-called millionaires' colony on Upper Fifth Avenue last August when he purchased the marble house of Isaac Stern near 67th Street. No residence in this neighborhood attracts more attention than the elaborate, even fantastic mansion of Senator William A. Clark, 5th Avenue and 77th Street. It has been in course of construction since 1899. Its cost has been estimated at sums ranging from $3 million to $5 million. Senator Clark, the Copper King of Butte, will add a unique personality to the millionaires of New York. His purchases of pictures have attracted no less attention than his business and political contests. A recent estimate of Senator Clark's fortune at something over $150 million was considered not excessive. Two great foreign fortunes. Passing to the great fortunes abroad, the Rothschild millions appear as a colossus to be measured with a foot rule. Their united properties pass far beyond the 100 millions. In 12 years, they loan nearly $450 million to European governments. Some idea of their riches may be gained from the fact that since 1815, they have raised for Great Britain more than $1 billion, for Austria $250 million, for Prussia $200 million, for France $400 million, for Italy nearly $300 million, and for Russia more than $125 million. Compared with American fortunes, most of the other estates held in Europe seem small indeed. The property of the Duke of Portland, for example, is the second in point of importance in England. His estates comprise 183,200 acres, including the famous Welbeck Abbey and Sherwood Forest, and London properties in and around Regent, Welbeck, and Wimpole Streets, Cavendish Square, and Portland Road. The Duke's income is estimated at $1,500,000 a year. Thank you for watching today. Remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.